Welcome to Lutheran Answers. Today I'm joined by Jeremy Abrahamson. Jeremy, how you doing, bud?
Doing all right. And yourself?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you. How is it being the son of Abraham?
It has been the source of many jokes throughout my life, and I hope that eventually, when God blesses me with children, they do not cease.
Excellent. Wonderful. That's good. That's good. But like you'll be joking on them and they will be joking back on you.
See, my thought is, what was the scribe's name? I need to name one of my kids Baruch because of my name, and
Mm-hmm.
then we'll just keep it going.
Yeah. Great. Wonderful. Uh, so, Jeremy, tell me about yourself. You're a Lutheran.
Yep, I am a Lutheran. I'm a member of the ELS, Evangelical Lutheran Synod in the Midwest here.
Ah.
Um, I am the son of Joseph Abrahamson, who has served in the ministry for about 20 years and runs an article on pagan holidays and or claims of pagan sourcing for holidays and debunking those. Um, the as far as that background, most of our careers are very different because he's educated and I am not. I
Hmm.
am somebody who likes to read, and education never sat well with me, so I never got into it.
Okay.
One does.
So, you're the second ELS guy I've had on.
Mhm.
Tony Pittenger is an ELS pastor who wrote a book on Handel's Messiah. That's a wonderful, wonderful companion to seeing it live.
I have listened to that episode.
Yeah, yeah,
I have,
yeah.
and I do not know if Tony knows me, but I have met him on a few occasions.
Excellent. Yeah, it's I tell you, I mean, well, he'll know you after this. I mean, I don't know if you know, but this is the big leagues here, so
Honestly, with the
welcome.
hair color, that's probably the big sign. He knows my dad for sure. ELS, because the ELS is so small that
Yeah.
everybody knows. If you served in the ministry at all, everybody has strong opinions on everybody else. So the moment they see my name and my hair, they'll know who I am.
So, uh the ELS, that's the only group in fellowship with the Wells, huh?
Yep. We
Wow.
left the LCMS. My understanding is when they kept fellowship with the people who became the ELCA. And then since you guys parted ways, we never
That's
got back
us.
in touch.
That was us.
Hmm.
They maintained fellowship with the, I think the ALC and then the AALC.
The Because when the ELCA went off the rails in the 70s or 80s, my history's not great on that era, but you guys eventually parted ways with them, but we had already broken fellowship between our two synods, and we just haven't gotten that smoothed out yet.
Yeah, yeah. We the ELCA, the LCA ALC merger was in 1986 to form the ELCA,
Mhm.
and the AALC was formed out of 12 churches that abstained from that merger.
Mhm.
Um, and then I want to say it was in 88 or 89, 2 or 3 years afterwards, that we were able to establish a fellowship with the LCMS.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah.
and Jordan, so you're in the same fellowship as Jordan Cooper then?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. I hope I get to meet him one day. He seems very nice.
I hope you tell him every single class you have.
He's taught me a few times. He's taught me a few times. So
I my main video Luther, I guess technically you'd call him Luther now, but video game guru that I follow, that I mentioned in your chat room the other day, Razor Fist, just wound up in a conversation with Dr. Cooper on um the application of the papacy. And I was like, that is one of the most surreal events I never thought I would expect.
crossovers you don't expect to see.
And it was like, yeah, there's a cordial conversation. They understood each other, knew what they were talking about.
That's amazing. Yeah, and that's also a testament to that gentleman's intelligence because every time I've ever talked to Dr. Cooper, I'm going to be honest with you, I have no idea what we're talking about. He is really smart, and he makes me feel not very smart at all. So,
I assume his social skills are better than that from his podcast.
his social skills are amazing. I'm an idiot. See, that's the problem. I'm
Oh,
dumb.
well, then with me, you're in good company.
So, you wrote a book
Hmm.
that will be releasing sometime around the same time as this episode, so people will be able to buy it and read it. Um, Tell me about it.
So I've been writing off and on for better part of a decade now. Mostly, I published one collection of short stories about 10 years ago, or about 8 years ago, somewhere in there. It had terrible cover art, was terribly marketed, and nobody bought it, and they shouldn't. And I plan to republish all of those short stories in different contexts in a better play. If they want to read it, okay, but right now it was published
Link in
entirely.
description. Go buy
Link
it.
link not in description, but it is findable. the And for the last few years, I have been working on a book. You saw the mention of the name if you read the author's note, called The Doom of Helene,
Hmm.
um, which has been my public project, which everybody who follows me as an author has been interacting with me over. Due to a schedule change at work, it threw off my productivity on that. Excuse me, sorry, because I went to a 6-day schedule. I work food service, so I'm doing this in the side of food service. And so in October, I had an idea. I finished Blood Meridian and what other book at the same, The Black Company at the same time. Glenn Cook's The Black Company. And I picked up another book that was recommended to me based on, oh, you like grimdark stories, you should try this. And I picked it up, and within the first pages, I was just fervently disappointed at the meaningless carnage and offensiveness.
Hmm.
Because I won't pretend Blood Meridian is a lighthearted read, but it is by no means a wasteful read. And Glenn Cook is usually like a hard PG-13 at best, despite dealing constantly with the horrors of war. And so my thought was, why can't somebody just write a story, a fantasy story, that has the atmosphere of dread and oppression and horror, instead of just being as offensive and violent as possible?
Hmm.
And so I just thought, hey, I could write this in a month and see what happens. And I failed. I failed completely. It took me twice as long to write as I thought, and I only got a third of the original story I'd conceived into the novel before I finished it. So what I got was a story which is a fairy tale gothic western with strong Christian themes set in something that is probably the Byzantine Empire.
Okay. Okay. That's a vibe. I'm here
It,
for it.
it could fit into any genre. So
Sure.
if you're going to pick it, I would say dark fantasy was my pitch. But
Okay.
because I was basing it on other dark fantasy. But the actual final product, anything I write naturally gravitates towards westerns and gravitates towards high fantasy. So, and eventually decides to force religious themes into it, given long enough prose. So that's what happened. I wound up with a dark fantasy story that uh, I can binge in an afternoon, and I could binge this story in an afternoon. So I figure this is something I can do once it's out. I can pick it up on a rainy day and just read it in like 6 hours.
Okay. I read. You were kind enough to provide me with a review copy, and I read through some of the opening. And have you ever read The Gunslinger?
I have not read The Gunslinger due to a personal distaste with Stephen King's style of characterization and
Okay.
portrayals of religion. My
Yeah.
brother has been trying to convince me to read The Gunslinger for about 15 years. And I am aware that when he went out across the waste and the men in black followed, That was that is a phrase that almost certainly was subconsciously in my mind, though it was not an intentional reference.
Yeah. Well, it's just the whole, I don't know, the whole opening, the whole vibe.
Mhm.
Um, really very, very, first off, it's not a, it's not a bad comparison.
Right.
Because I loved The Gunslinger. I thought it was a very enjoyable book, a very good time. And reading your book and getting kind of shades of that same kind of fantasy western, sort of dark fantasy western, that's very much what The Gunslinger is. And it made me think, oh, I could read all of this. I could get into this,
Oh,
because it's like this other thing I like. It's hard for me to find books I like to read in the not in the fiction side because most authors are not very good.
yes.
Yeah,
The
I
majority of books are not good.
yeah, I I just I remember I picked up, it was supposed to be a horror novel and
Mhm.
it was never really very unsettling at all at any point, but I ended up throwing it away like halfway through because the author of the novel couldn't get out of his own way throughout the novel. So like there was one part where it was like David agreed to go over to his coworker's house for hamburgers. He knew eating vegan was the best for the environment, but he just couldn't bring himself to do it. And it was like, what's that? Why was that sentence in there? Where was your editor?
There was a good way to write that phrase as characterization, and that was not what that quote that said.
Yeah.
If
Well, and
that's
the
the faithful
problem,
quotation, that's not what they did.
yeah, and the problem is every character was like that. Every character had a view on why all cops are bastards, or why we need to defund the police, or be vegans, or support our LGBTQ friends as allies. Like every single character had these thoughts, and it was, you could tell it was just the author's thoughts, and he didn't know how to put them in there skillfully, so he just kind of jammed them in there. And about halfway through the book, and I threw it away. I was like, this is hot garbage.
Well, it nailed being anarchic horror. Uh, what's the you're probably the right generation, but I don't know if it would have been on your wheelhouse. You ever play the name of the game was Spec Ops: The Line?
I never got far into it. I only played that demo they released.
The author has gone on record saying the good ending of the game is stopping halfway through.
That's great.
It's I mean, it's a faithful adaptation, an attempt to be a faithful adaptation of Joseph Conrad to bro military shooter games.
Hmm.
And his like, I mean, if you want the ideal ending, just stop playing.
Yeah,
That's
I heard that that game is satirical, a satirical take on sort of games like that,
Mhm.
and that as the game progresses, your choices get worse and worse as your character becomes more and more unhinged, and by the end of the game, you realize, oh, I'm the bad guy.
My quitting point was when the best possible outcome was to use white phosphorus on a large group of civilians, and then they forced
Yeah.
you through it. That
Hmm.
was about where I was like, this is excellent for what they're trying to do. I can't take it.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Maybe I
Yeah.
can do it now. I'm a harder, colder person now, but at the time, I'm young and full of hope.
Uh, man, thank God life beats that out of you, huh?
Well,
That's great.
I mean, well, to bring this back to the book, let's talk about the highest form of literature,
Okay.
the tragedy. There is no higher form. The tragedy is man achieves and achieves and achieves and gets stronger and stronger, and then everything that put them on that path tears them to the ground.
Hmm.
And then the story of the Bible is the highest tragedy, which is the eucatastrophe, which is, in spite of that, God saves us anyway.
Hmm.
uh, so, I mean, I don't know whether I'd consider Spec Ops: The Line a classic tragedy, but it's certainly at least colloquially tragic.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think all the greatest works of literature are at least partially tragic.
I could see that. I could
Um,
see that.
well, sorry, continue.
I was just gonna ask, how do you, as a Christian and a faithful Christian, how do you balance that with writing? Do you feel the need to inject sort of faith or catechesis into your literature? Like, do you feel the need to? Do you ever have an idea for a story and then think, ah, I can't write that. It's a good idea, but I can't write that.
Are you familiar with Tolkien's discussion of allegory?
Not maybe vaguely, not intimately. No.
The quote is, I cordially despise allegory in all its parts and forms." And I probably got that a couple words wrong, and somebody's going to catch that on the internet and say, "Hey, you don't know your Tolkien." But
Whatever, nerds.
the I actually think he's wrong. In this, he makes a distinction between. I'm prefacing this. He makes a distinction between allegory, which is the attempt to portray a real world concept as a through a story and resolve it, and then applicability being the insertion of universal themes into a work that can be transferred to the reader's circumstances. In Tolkien's own writing style, this was Roman Catholicism, and I would say actually much more broadly, it was little c Catholicism with some flavor of Roman Catholicism. Um, I have quipped that his Frodo's journey was a little too semi-Pelagian for my preference, but as far as a story, it still works for the form he's using. I think he was wrong about his discussion of allegory because he was deliberately drawing contrast between himself and his friend C.S. Lewis and Narnia. Narnia is not an allegorical story at all. Narnia is a theological discussion in the form of a children's story, but it is not allegorical. All of the topics are discussed plainly.
Hmm.
And the more you research into the topics, the more you learn, the more Dr. Cooper episodes you listen to, the more clear it becomes that Narnia was never intended to be read as an allegory in the first place and was intended to have the parents sitting there and converse with children. That is kind of in a nutshell my philosophy is, if this book is to be read to children, the book I sent you is not, by the way. Please do not read it to your kids. If it is, but if you were to, the idea is, I think a story is meant to be shared. So reading it with your wife is a different question. And you're supposed to just sit there and discuss and understand what it is going on in the story through the ideas of, well, through your, how would I say? Every story is fundamentally true at its most basic parts. And it's either an attempt to malign the truth or it's an attempt to confess the truth. And that can't be escaped no matter how creative you try to be.
Hmm.
The Tolkien recognized that, C.S. Lewis recognized that. I think Brandon Sanderson once commented that George R. R. Martin couldn't escape it. The Mormon once made a quip that George R. R. Martin could not help but write conservative works because he was writing works that were based in history.
Hmm.
Even though George R. R. Martin is by no means a conservative, right?
Yeah. He's also by no means a good author. Just gonna throw that out there. I'm not a
I've
not
heard
a
good
fan.
and bad and middle. I've seen the show. I thought season 5 was the worst. Uh, I have very little disappointment in season 8 that wasn't around from the beginning. And I assume that the reason the final books got canned was because people complained about George R. R. Martin's ideas and he didn't want it to get blamed on him.
Yeah. Well, it was a TikTok sketch that I saw the other day where someone was making fun of Martin, and it was like his publisher was like, "Hey, when's that last book coming?" And he was like, "Oh man, it's just a couple years away, but I do have this other book that I wrote in the meantime that you can." And they're like, "Yeah, that's cool. I mean, we'll publish that, but what about you said it's a couple years away, this final book, but that's what you said a couple years ago, and what you said a couple years before that. Like, we've been waiting on this book for 10 years. And finally, Martin admits, he goes, well, you know what the problem is I've made a lot of money. I've made a lot of money since then. It makes it really hard to write.
Well, 'cause here's the thing. Are you familiar with Patrick Rothfuss?
No.
He is an author equally infamous for a controversial way of communicating with his fans and a final book that keeps getting delayed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, every time I've seen any interviews with him, he's heavily apologetic, and I don't know if this is his universal position. I'm not a fanboy of his to follow him, right? But he always comes across saying, this is my fault. I let it get out of hand. And Martin always goes, "Oh, writing just takes a long time." And you look back at Martin's catalog in the early '90s, and he has a book every other year.
Yeah.
And that's before he even starts Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, look at Stephen King. Look at Lee Child. Lee Child pumped out a book a year.
how many pages was the book, that the PDF I sent you?
297, something like that.
And this was 2 months.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Stephen King says that it only takes him 3 months to write any given book, and the rest of the year is editing and revising and this and that. But that the book is written within the first 3 or 4 months of the year.
I completely believe that.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I'm not sure I believe how much of his editor has a role in the story, but I completely believe that.
yeah, yeah.
um,
Well, when you got a money machine like King, I think you just let it print.
yeah. And like you mentioned him earlier as a compliment. I accept that compliment with grace, because my personal beefs with King are entirely due to his, like you quipped earlier, ideology working its way into the stories.
Yeah.
Um,
I did see an interview with King and Martin where they asked them, how do you, what's your process or whatever? And King mentioned that he sits down and writes 6 pages a day, every day. First thing he does, he wakes up, he sits down, he writes 6 pages. And like, that's his thing, his morning coffee and 6 pages of story. Doesn't have to be the book he's working on, just 6 pages of something. Just keep it going.
500
And,
pages in 3 months. That sounds right.
and yeah, well, and Martin says, Martin goes, oh, but don't you ever just sit there and you stare at the cursor for 3 or 4 hours and it blinks and blinks and blinks and nothing comes to you and you have no idea what to write and you're just stuck. What doesn't that ever happen to you? And Stephen King just said, no. Like, no, I'm a writer, George. I write.
And King's correct here. It is very difficult for me to concede that my problem with is author's block. When I screw up, it is always procrastination.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Or fear, right? Like, uh, for me, when I want to write something and I don't, it's fear. It's, what if this doesn't turn out the way I see it in my head? And it's easier just to not. It's easier to just enjoy the fantasy in my own head than actually try and commit it to paper.
well, I mean, if you were to attribute the greatest high point of Stephen King's career to crack cocaine and copious amounts of other forms of cocaine, you could probably attribute mine to the tism and just having everything perfectly planned out before I start putting it down.
Yeah.
Um, the and too much coffee. uh, as every true good Norwegian, I drink something like 5 cups a day some days.
Perfect. Beautiful.
The yeah, I don't see. There's always something to write. There's always an idea. There's always something. And if you don't like how it goes down, you can always look at it and say, you ever get that feeling when you're sitting in front of a movie and you're like, I like the idea they had, but they could have done it this other way instead.
Yeah.
And the in my personal case, that I just, like, if I have to make corrections to my own story, it happens in that same way. Is I like what I was going for. Why don't I just move this part over here?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, like, I'm not saying no first prose is perfect, and this is my first book. It's not even going to be close to perfect. But it's not like there's a shortage in this world of things that can go onto paper.
Right.
Uh, the this story, the first chapter, I had probably written 50% of it the first night. And that was just spur of the moment before I even made the commitment to finish it. Um, it's, it is, there's so much in the world, in the ideas, they're in that you see, you meet, you talk to people, you read, you watch. I'm a prolific reader and cinemaphile, so, and I'm not as prolific a gamer, but I do gravitate towards story-driven games or
Yeah.
games that focus on storytelling, of which Elden Ring is one of them, by the way.
Also, Martin, right? Didn't he?
He was
He helped
credited
like with the world
involved
building.
in Elden Ring. I
Yeah.
do not know how much, because the final product is very Miyazaki.
Yeah.
But in the end, there's. I'm going to plug Razor Fist again, and in this form, I'm going to say I cordially disagree with him because I respect him a lot, but I don't really think there's such a thing as plagiarism when it comes to copying ideas. Because there's always, every time you copy an idea, you're going to copy it in your own way. The only way you could really plagiarize is pretend another idea was your own. And nothing in this book is original whatsoever. Like it from the first page to the end, you mentioned the gunslinger. The last line is a quotation from another book. Uh, and I don't think that it's possible to write an original book. Or have a desire to find out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even I'm a wannabe author myself. I have many ideas and many scraps of things in a folder on my computer. And even all of my best stuff it's that exact thing where I was watching a movie or reading a book and thought they could have done this better if they had done it this way. And then I get to thinking about doing it this way. And then I start thinking about all of the sort of what was preceding it getting to this way. And then before I know it, I've started formulating a whole new thing.
One of my buddies from he's a good guy. He's unfortunately not Christian, but he should. He'll hear this episode, and I'm just like beat him over the head with a stick with this. But he's a genuinely great man. Um, has told me many times that ideas sometimes you need to chill before trying to put something to paper because there are just too many things you could put down.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that's true for a lot of people, and they just don't test it. They don't engage it at all.
I
Um,
Yeah, no, I was going to say I agree with that wholeheartedly actually.
mhm.
You're never going to run out of like good ideas. They're everywhere.
um, in this, dialing back because I see we've used about half of our time. Um, the or however much you've allotted. Um, in this particular thing, I would not and referencing your earlier point about how you would talk about Christian themes. This is not a catechetical book in any way, and it's only scarcely considerable a Christian book. I would not plug it to an evangelical audience. They would despise it.
Right.
Uh, this would be like Harry Potter, the sort of thing that people grow up a generation later and are surprised to find out the author's Christian.
Right.
Um, Even though I think Harry Potter is wonderfully Christian, and you have to and if you've read any C.S. Lewis at all, or Once and Future King, and you reread Harry Potter, you're like, this isn't even subtle.
Right.
um, but because of the way the evangelical community is with fiction and media in general, this is not the sort of story where the man has a crisis of faith and realizes he needs to make his decision for this is that stuff doesn't happen.
Right.
I don't mean that in the sense of my theology doesn't mean it happens. I mean, there's nobody who ever makes a decision for anything that they haven't already been convinced they're going to do. This isn't limited to faith. I don't go out to drive unless I believe the car will hold me.
That's right.
You don't decide to trust the car. I've never met anyone who's ever decided to trust the car. They were just baptized by their parents when they're carried in their car seats as a baby.
That's right. No, that's right. The
Um,
thing works, so we just do it.
and we treat the people who think the cars are not going to work as people who have met, like some sort of severe issue that they have to fix.
When has a car never not worked?
When it is manufactured by General Motors.
Oh, got him. I'm a Ford guy, so go ahead.
I do have a Shelby cup in my closet, but today I decided to bring the St. Nicholas Punch Heretics cup as sold by
That's so good.
Daily Roman Updates on Twitter.
That's so good.
But yeah, as far as this goes with the story, I do not think my views on abortion will be subtle, but it is not a book about abortion.
Right.
I don't think anybody will come away from the story with any illusions as to my stances on abortion or human trafficking. But it's not a story about either of those. It's a story about a bunch of knights who get hired to hunt witches. No, not hired, conscripted. They get sent out to hunt down witches and wipe out a witch coven. And anybody who's read Germanic folklore knows that witches steal children. And these ideas do not come from a vacuum, because humanity is, despite my earlier comment that there's no shortage of ideas, humanity is absolutely incapable of coming up with any new ones.
Mm-hmm.
People have always stolen and abducted children. People have always abused and hurt them. And witches, whether I do not agree with the historical Catholic position that witchcraft has never existed, obviously, but I also think that the Puritans were not Christian. So there's definitely a happy medium in here, right?
The Puritans and all other forms of Baptist are not Christian.
I don't consider the New England Puritans, I don't consider them Baptists.
Well, I consider most everybody I don't like a Baptist. I use it like a slur.
That's fair. I mean, I can confidently join with you on that, endorse that sort of behavior. But yeah, no, the New England Puritans, I don't know how you could possibly categorize them under Catholic Christianity, small C Catholic. There were probably Christians in the communities, but it was not a confessional fellowship in any way. Mm-hmm. And whether intentionally or unintentionally, because we do have people who say deeds, not creeds, but they still have a confession. That doesn't mean that their confession isn't a Christian one, even if they're trying not to be. The New England Puritans were not that. Cromwell was responsible for everything bad that has happened to America.
I was reliably informed that it was actually Martin Luther who was responsible for just every bad thing.
Oh, I've been informed as well.
I got a notification that my credit score went down 4 points because I just opened a new credit card, and I was like, Luther!
So, you'll have fun with the world I'm building in this story. Is an idea that, what if the Roman Church stayed Lutheran instead of falling away during the early medieval period?
That is good.
In order for there to be now, unfortunately, in order for me to eliminate the political situation that caused them to fall away, I had to vastly rerail history, so the Muslims won.
Yeah.
For want of a better word.
Yep.
But in the context of the situation, the Roman Church, though it is not identified as such, I'm trying to keep it as Lutheran as possible without losing any of the Roman trappings. The nothing is religiously explicit aside. I do plan to put Bible verses at the beginning of each chapter. You don't have the version that has that because I hadn't decided which ones they're going to be. And I want to not just source Jeremiah for all of them, which is,
You should, though.
I mean, because Jeremiah is wonderful.
Yeah.
It ties right in with this kind of
I was
fantasy.
going to say, I can tell you right now, it fits the vibe, dude. It fits the theme.
The first one I have on this is pulling up right now, 8 Witch Hunters. Thus they have loved to wander, they have not refrained their feet. Therefore the Lord doth not accept them. He will remember their iniquity and visit their sins. And
Excellent.
but that's related to the opening chapter you read with the person who's wandering across the wasteland. Um, but the in this idea, by the time the story happens, we don't really know how long has passed since the rise of whatever tribe is serving as my allegory for the Islamic expansion, and how long since they've fallen, because obviously that if they'd conquered, they wouldn't have stayed in power. God wouldn't have allowed that to happen. Um, but the well, I'm glad they didn't, because this is the best case scenario, unfortunately for humanity, is the fact that the Roman Church was allowed to fall away.
Hmm.
I would have liked to imagine that the Lutherans would have done a better job, but we saw what the 1800s were like. um, the but yeah, the best case scenario for humanity was the Roman Catholic Church eventually fell and became corrupted and led to the Great Schism of Trent. Um, the and in this story, which is at least at least spiritually and culturally and possibly also geographically a different trajectory from that path. Um, I have chosen to have characters who wear the trappings of the Byzantine Empire while still having Lutheran justifications for what they do. Um, and the characters who are redeemed through the story are clearly redeemed in spite of themselves.
Hmm.
Um, the which does not mean that the attempt to redeem others isn't practiced by believers, because that's what we're supposed to do.
Correct.
um, the there is a you probably haven't gotten to that point, but the story has a very high amount of violence in it. Um,
I have not gotten to that point.
um, the my thought on that is violence is real. And that's not a political statement on U.S. foreign policy. Um, that is
Please don't get my show on a watch list.
that that is the nature of man, right? We are always going to find a reason to kill one another,
Yeah.
and in the end, it is not as much as we would like it to be. We should always teach and aspire and praise the knights in shining armor, but most of the people who God gets to do the dirty work are other monsters. Um, and throughout the story, it will be very clear that essentially these soldiers that are sent out on this commission are essentially a church-sanctioned hit squad. Um, and I hope it is very clear why such a thing is necessary by the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
This is not an ideological difference thing, unless you concede the mass murder of thousands of children to be an ideological difference. Which I guess in this modern liberal society people do.
Yeah, I mean, how many babies do we abort each year?
More than the entirety of the Holocaust,
It's insane.
whose numbers were probably underrepresented.
Insane.
Um, it is Western society, and abortion is a mass murdering machine which the world has never seen the like of.
Yeah.
And in the name of self gratification.
What was that European country that just was so excited because they've nearly eliminated Down syndrome,
Iceland.
Iceland through abortion. But the problem is, you can't eliminate Down syndrome because while there are genetic probabilities for it, there are people that do have a higher genetic probability to have children with Down syndrome. There is a good portion of it that is just genetic fluke. So
In
like you can't eliminate it. It's like even if no one had any markers for it, you could still have it. And the only way they're eliminating it is just murdering children.
in a perfectly eugenic society, I wouldn't exist. It's autism spectrum. They would be able to figure that ages ago. They would have killed me off in the stomach. My parents, thank God, are practicing Lutherans. I would not have abided by that, but a perfect modernist eugenicist society would have directly opposed their ability to make that choice for themselves. Um, it's it is, and that's just modernism. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Like
Yeah.
when you hear this is one of the things I hope becomes clear in this work is that when you see your wacky conspiracy brother who's like talking about, oh, the lizard people, man, da da da, and he's completely off on the wrong track. But the stuff he's talking about is happening. He just hasn't.
Right.
He's falling for the caca about how it happens. Um,
Yeah.
the child sacrifice, the adrenochrome, the I'm not going to go say the Moloch worship because probably somewhere, but the who needs to worship Moloch when peace, peace, there is no peace. You have yourself.
Hmm.
It's the when in Jeremiah when God says that the children of Israel are going to eat their own children, he's not just referring to this. He's not referring to the starvation exclusively. He's referring to the sort of things that were already going on that are seen as acceptable, and he's going to say it's going to happen to the point you get sick on it. um, and while Eight Witch Hunters does not directly address abortion as a whole as a political issue, I do not think that there's any reason to shy away from how people have treated the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
And tell themselves they are good people. It's I mean I will say in light of people thinking, oh man, this is gonna be some sort of thought experiment. This is my first novel. I don't expect to be particularly well written or nuanced. There's probably gonna be some people who say, oh, this is some sort of Christian vengeance fantasy, and you're not incorrect. um, this is it is, again, I stated this several times, a book I would be able to read in 6 hours because I'm in a mood that I want to read something dark and brooding. And
Hmm.
so it is dark and brooding. It's just based on the real dark and brooding stuff I know.
Yeah.
Um, the and I thought that just because something is dark and brooding and violent doesn't necessarily mean it can't confess the reality of God's redemption. Even though I am sure that there's going to be a lot of people who are Christian, who are faithful Christians, who read this and don't necessarily understand how that's what's confessing. That is still something I was consciously trying to do. Um, the Aside from wholesalely rip off a bunch of authors that I like.
Well, I mean,
It's good books are good books. They deserve to be homaged. And in my
yeah.
case, I'm not nearly smart enough to do something wholly original. So I'm sure my Proto-Turkish is wrong. And somebody is going to fix it for me.
Well, and like we were talking, who knows what ideas you may spawn, uh, with the stuff you write.
Right. I do have ideas. I mean, I know this is, as I said, this is a third of the story I plan to tell. So, God willing, there will be sequels. Um, Probably spaced out however long it will take to make sure I'm still focusing on Doom of Helene, my bigger novel at the same time. Because that book I want to finish before my grandma dies, because she has encouraged me that if she dies and passes on before I finish that novel and she doesn't get a chance to read it, she'll be waiting with a wooden spoon on the other side of the gate for me.
God knows you can't. No, and you can't test her on that because I'm willing to bet. I'm willing to bet she would.
I don't think that God has any reason to prevent people from visiting that
Exactly. Exactly.
um the it's I'm grateful for having a chance to write something like this that even touches that people who like the same authors I like have a chance to enjoy.
What
I'm
authors are those?
I like a lot of authors. Like in this case, the author that I was most heavily referencing was Cormac McCarthy. And as far as like my approach to combat and operations and stuff, was borrowing heavily from Glenn Cook, who served in the military, and his Black Company series, which people should read, is very heavily attempt to appropriate real world combat whenever possible, even though it's a fantasy story. Um, Similarly, I have the same opinion in this story. I do not have a combat background. I very much do not know what I'm talking about in this, but I at least tried to steal from people who do.
There you go.
Uh,
Yeah.
um, I, as has been very clear throughout this, I'm a huge Tolkien and Lewis fan. I'm a fan of J.K. Rowling, which Christians aren't supposed to be.
Hmm. Yep. I wasn't
um,
allowed to read her books growing up.
yep. I also recommend, because I would feel ashamed if I didn't plug him. An author whose work affected the way I do catechesis in this is I'm brain farting on his name, Gene Wolfe. Um, Gene Wolfe was a Roman Catholic who wrote sci-fi very heavily, and his book, The Book of the Long Sun, is a very interesting Augustinian conversation, set in a post-apocalypse. And of course, if we're talking about post-apocalypse, you have to do Canticle for Leibowitz, which is like one of the greatest works ever written. um, but in this case, I'm mostly borrowing from Glenn Cook, McCarthy, and um, from the theology side, C.S. Lewis and um, Gene. Sorry,
Wolf.
Gene Wolfe. Yeah, the it is. I don't think that any of these influences are going to be unclear. I think that there's going to be a lot of people who say you're not good enough to do Cormac McCarthy, and I wholeheartedly agree with them. uh, but the man who my friend I mentioned earlier, who introduced me to Cormac McCarthy, uh, and it was the reason I can speak Spanish, because he told me how much there would be when I got into it. I was like, okay, well then I have to learn the language before I pick it up.
Amazing.
um, the my thought process, or it's this book lives and breathes McCarthy. It's a lot. It's a lot more grounded. It's a lot less surreal than McCarthy's works, but it is very much a attempt by somebody who should know better than attempting to try anyway, because nobody else is doing it. Nobody better is doing it. um, and it's also like I said, it's a deeply Christian book. It is something that I don't think could have. It is something I could have not escaped writing it in a Christian way had I wanted to.
Hmm.
Um, which does not mean you're going to get your evangelical happy ending. I
Right.
want to hammer that in, not just as a theological thing, but I want to emphasize that I said earlier the greatest form of storytelling is tragedy.
Yeah.
um, there's no. There's no escape from that. Uh, and then, of course, the other people that, when it comes to theology, that is heavily, I would not have been able to write any of my books without, is a certain Dr. Cooper,
Yep.
who is on a regular rotation on my list. And this one Frenchman, I think, has been on my playlist for the last couple of years, uh, who started up this counterpart to this Catholic channel and then brags about his fanboying over his professor all the time. I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard of that guy. He's a hack. His show's trash.
No, no, seriously, I'm very grateful you've given me a chance to be on this, because I meant it completely unironically when I said in the post I'm the wrong guest.
Dude, it's been fun so far. It's funny because I think my initial volley question here was totally selfish and self-serving, because a lot of the reason that I don't end up writing is because I worry if it has to be some kind of Christian theological work. Because like sometimes I want to write something that just has nothing to do with any kind of theology. That's just, I want to write something fun that's just fun and it just is what it is. Um, or that's scary and it's just scary. It is what it is. I
Right.
have this idea for what I call a rug pull horror,
Okay.
where I started out in one genre and it's that genre the whole way through.
Mhm.
And then at the very end, in the last act, it goes into the most horrific horror story you've ever read, and everyone who bought the book is really angry and they want to refund it, and very few of them finish it. And I just think that would be perfect. I think that would be great. You just pull the rug right out and you're like, oh, gotcha. My initial idea was to write a trashy romance novel, and then like right in the third act it just gets really freaky and there's no more romance. And just how far into it would the romance readers get before they put it down, you
Well,
know?
in the light of intentionally alienating all my possible fans on both sides of every aisle, I am a Ryan Johnson fan.
Okay, I wish I got that joke. I wish I knew who that was.
He wrote Last Jedi.
Oh, I get that joke now.
Yeah,
It was the best of the Star Dorks movies.
I have not seen a movie of his that I disliked. I've not seen all of
Wow.
his movies. Um,
Important caveat.
but Last Jedi is one of the ones I did like, and it is absolutely a rug pull movie.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I like that idea. But I struggle with it because I think like does this have to be explicitly Christian in some kind of way? And it's funny because the answer that you gave over the course of this podcast is that you don't have to set out to write it that way. No, like there's no obligation to write something intentionally Christian. But people tend to write what they know and they tend to write what is true, if they write something good. And so you don't have to write an intentionally Christian story, but don't be surprised if the story comes out being quite Christian.
Don't, here's what I would say: don't try to subvert except to have fun. Do not
Mm,
try to subvert to make a point. People aren't good at that. Even the best authors aren't good at that. The authors who are really good at that are nobody knows who they are.
right. Yeah, right.
Um, the my brother has quipped, and this is directly referencing your pitch. John McTiernan is the only person to have successfully done a genre switch movie 3 times.
Okay.
Predator, Die Hard, and The 13th Warrior.
Yep. Okay.
Um, all three of those are rug pull movies, and that is an accomplishment that is unheard of in cinema.
Yeah.
Uh, the reason I like Ryan Johnson is because I'm convinced that he's having fun. But the fact that he tried to make a point while doing it is half the reason people found Last Jedi so alienating. Uh,
Mm,
I don't think the point he was trying to make is the point people took away from it, because I don't think he pulled it off.
gotcha.
um, it is not at all. I think people went on took what it seemed like he was trying to say and ran with that and missed the point he was making, not because it was too smart, but because he tried to do too much. Um,
Mm.
the
He got in his own way.
he got in his own way, and so to be subversive, the reason you should be subversive is to so you can sit there and say, Wait for it.
Yeah.
Wait for it. You troll your audience. We do a little trolling. It's okay. We have some fun here. Um,
We have the best trolls.
it's okay to mess with people. We all do it. We're both active on Twitter. It's half of our engagement.
It's
It's
true. It's 100% true.
it is okay to, but if you're gonna write a 1,200-page book that turns out to be a deliberate prank, you got to commit to that bit that the whole
Yeah.
point of the book is the prank.
Yeah. Yeah. You really do have to commit, because if you don't, you end up in the Last Jedi hot seat, right? You end up in not pulling it off.
Yeah. I want to emphasize, I think it's a fun movie. It's not a great movie. It's a Star Wars movie. They're all bad. I grew up on Star Wars. I will never stop watching Star Wars.
They're all bad. I'm clipping that. That's so good.
No one can convince
uh,
me not to show my kids the original trilogy a dozen times because I
sure.
love them. But you can't convince me George Lucas wasn't changing his mind 16 times during the course of any given one of those films.
Sure. Well, and okay, so like when people ask me what my favorite Star Wars movies are,
Mhm.
it's the second trilogy. And the reason it's the second trilogy is because Star Wars wasn't big in my house, and
Mhm.
I was in middle school when those movies started coming out, and all of my friends were really into it, and I went to saw them, and they were fun. I was, 12 or whatever, and it was a great time.
All right.
And so those movies will, I watched the older ones. Then when I got older, I went back and watched the original trilogy, and I've
Mhm.
seen, I think, two of the. I haven't seen. I've seen the only the newest one of the. I've seen the first one of the newest trilogy, but I. It's not. I don't think that second trilogy was the best because it was the best story. It's just it was the one that I grew up with and the one I had fun with. I don't know. Like,
Here,
does it have to be more complex than that?
here is my street cred because people are going to say, hey, you like the Last Jedi. You're clearly excluding yourself from street cred. My dad used to put on the VHSs before the special editions as babysitting to me when we were kids and my mom had to work. I
Yeah.
think I saw those movies 40 times
Yeah.
between the ages of 4 and 7. But I was also the right age when episode 1 came out to think that Jar Jar was funny.
Exactly. Exactly.
I am not going to say that it's secretly some smart film. I think there are clever things it does because Ryan Johnson isn't a hack. Anybody who's seen Knives Out knows that. Um, but I don't think it's a great movie because he bit off more than he could chew. He didn't stick the landing. Um, and it's par for the course for Star Wars. If you take episode 1 and you cut off everything before they escape from Naboo completely and they're on their way to Tatooine, the only plot relevant beat you miss that isn't explained later is who Jar Jar is and why he's there. That is
It's
the only thing.
it's that reminds me of like Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark,
Yeah,
and how Indiana Jones is actually completely incidental to the entire story. And he
right.
he actually has nothing to do with the. You could take him completely out of the movie, and it would go the exact same.
It's a great Indiana Jones is a great confession of Lutherans. What's the phrase?
Soteriology.
Soteriology.
Yeah,
That's the word I'm looking for.
it is.
Uh,
It is. He tries his best, accomplishes nothing, and then God saves him. God bless.
and to quote an author that I cite in this book, and is a movie that had a huge influence on this book, and any fan of his was gonna say, "Wow, you were not subtle." And then I woke up. It's. I assume you've seen No Country, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and the entire plot happens completely incidentally to any of the characters, and the punishment the villain gets is something nobody could have seen coming.
I need to
And
rewatch that movie again too. That's a good one.
it's the story the we like to think men are destroyed by their own devices, but usually they're destroyed. The evil men are destroyed by the selfish devices of other evil men.
Yeah.
And World War II is a great example of that because FDR was the one who won it.
Hmm. It's funny. It's funny you say that. That's my argument when people say that like there's an Illuminati or some kind of secret ultra powerful group of people running the world. That's my argument against it, is they would be so busy infighting with each other for control that they would never actually do anything.
Well, you see, that's why the people they paint the most heavily as the people who do that are also a culture that's famous for not agreeing on anything.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's funny because going back to the guy who's obsessed with the lizard people and he's just getting it wrong. It's funny because that's true. People think there's an Illuminati and they think there's some kind of evil force pulling the strings behind the world, because there is, but it's not Hillary Clinton or Bill Gates or whoever, the Rothschilds. It's the devil. It's actually just, it's Satan, right? Like it looks like there's an evil malevolent force because the devil is real.
The gospel is when God shows us what was obvious all along. And then
Yeah.
Gnosticism, as we say, so what else is hidden?
Yeah. Yeah. That's good.
I have a very dear friend of mine. She's like a sister. She's also a lovely person, but she is a Muslim and has been her whole life. And I once explained what Gnosticism was. I was like, anytime someone says, but they all wrote lies and here's the real story.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm hoping someday she catches up on that because I would love to see her in paradise someday.
Amen.
It's we are our own worst enemies all of the time.
Amen. God, dude. Yeah. Yeah, we are.
Well, I don't really have anything else aside from the hype train on this hype train, aside from, I guess, restating what we've already stated. Watch No Country.
Mm-hmm.
The Last Jedi was actually kind of fun.
Okay.
And my ever-present plug in your chat room, Lutherans need to read The Once and Future King, and they're missing out on the greatest confession of Lutheran justification ever written.
Excellent. Excellent. And we will try and schedule this so that it comes out around the same time as your book, so that we can, I'm sorry, I'm saving my show notes, so that we can make sure to have a link to that book. I also did find your other book of short stories, and
The Chain?
yep, The Chain. I did find it, and it is available on Amazon. I will be putting a link, just because I can, and you can't stop me. So,
if you want to buy the thing that isn't even spelled correctly and it's Amazon posting, go for it. I will appreciate it. I probably won't get a penny from it.
yeah.
And like I said,
Excellent.
all these stories are going to be republished anyway later.
Perfect. Waste your money now to help support him so that you can waste your money later. Perfect.
Any other questions you had for me on this, like from the show notes or from the like author's note I sent you before we set up? Because obviously you have a lot more experience with this sort of thing than I do.
No, I liked in the author's note, you did advise people to sit with it. You did advise people to take if something was challenging or difficult, don't skip it, but wait and then try again. And I think that's good. I think that's good advice just for reading in general.
Or Elden Ring.
Or Elden Ring, which is destroying me. I'm actually considering just getting Silent Hill and picking a different game and moving on.
Continue your story. Sorry, your thoughts.
Yeah. So I think that's I think that's just really good advice, and I can't wait to finish the book myself,
Okay.
early copy or not.
Yeah. Thank you again for giving me this chance. And I expect by the latest they should be available in January. I just don't know when because I have the logistics to get all sorted out.
Excellent.
I'm self-publishing through Ingram Sparks, so I have full editorial control, which may mean that sometimes I'll miss commas. Some of those
Right.
missed commas are not accents, but some of them are.
Excellent. Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you, Remy. You have a wonderful day and God bless.
You too.